Hello economics students. In this video we're going to look at how we actually measure this thing called inflation or the inflation rate, and we do it using the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI for short. Now, indices or indexes are really important in economics, and you might see this in other parts of the course. But what they really do is simplify a large data set, so lots of different data or lots of different numbers, into one simple, easy to read number, easy to calculate number. And we call that the CPI. Now, for inflation, what we're trying to do is understand the changes in prices of lots and lots of different goods and services. But we obviously don't want to list each individual good and service. So what we do is we simplify it into the CPI. Now, you also need to know the difference between what we call the headline measure of inflation and the underlying measure of inflation, which we'll look at in this video. So, first of all, the headline measure for inflation is basically the CPI, or is measured using the CPI. And I always think of headline as being like the top number. Your head is at the top. It's had no adjustments. In accounting, you have a top line number, revenue, no adjustments, as opposed to something that's underlying, which has had some adjustments, which we'll look at in a moment. So the CPI is the headline rate of inflation for simplicity. And what the CPI does, as I alluded to, is it measures changes in the price of 100,000 different goods and services. And what we're trying to do is get an understanding of the average cost of living, or the cost of living for an average metropolitan or city household. All right, now, instead of giving us 100,000 different price changes, we're going to simplify it into an index, and then from the index, we can very simply measure the change in that index, or the rate of change, which is the inflation rate. So just to show you what I'm talking about here, because sometimes in a SAC or an exam, you'll get given the index, and your job will be to calculate the growth in the index, or the change between one period. Now, we don't need to know how these indexes are made up, but you will look at that at university, and you can certainly have a look if you want, but it's quite complicated. So our job is to look at these index numbers and calculate the inflation rate. Just to give you a look at what the ABS data actually looks like, it is broken down into a number of different groups. And the reason we do that is sometimes prices go up, sometimes prices go down for different goods and services, and it gives economists better information about what's going on in the economy. So over the December to March quarter, education prices went up by 5.3%, clothing and footwear prices went down by 2.6%. This also helps with what's called weighting. So if you think about it, some of these groups are less important to the average household. Hopefully this one's less important. Certainly this one's less important. So when they're calculating inflation, the ABS gives a higher weighting to things that are really important, like food and housing and health, those sorts of things. All of which is outside what you need to know for a VCE student, but it's helpful to know what's going on. Okay, so like I said, the top line number, our headline or CPI, is up the top here. It's 1.4%, and that means over the period from December to March, the CPI grew by 1.4%, or inflation was 1.4%. Now, our bottom line, or our underlying figures, which are all the way down here, are going to be our trimmed mean and our weighted median. And let's have a look at what they are and why they are used. So the reason that we look at underlying inflation is that there might be a situation where there is a change in the price of a good or service, or even a group of goods or services, which is really just a one-off change. And that could be an increase in those prices. They could become really expensive for some reason, or they could become really cheap. Now, if it's only a one-off change, it doesn't make sense to include those prices in our inflation figures. When the ABS reports inflation, or when the RBA makes a decision about what to do with interest rates based on inflation, it doesn't make sense to include price changes that are volatile or one-off, because it may make inflation look a lot worse than it actually is, or it might make inflation seem a lot better than it actually is. So economists are smart, and what they do is they remove the effects of these one-off price changes, or these volatile price changes. There's a couple of ways they can do this. At the ABS, what they do is just exclude. It's called the exclusion method. They just look at the data and they say, hey, look, petrol prices went down 30% because there was a new law passed or a new policy passed to remove the excise tax. And they just don't include that in the CPI or in the inflation rate. There's two other methods that the ABS uses, and these are more statistical methods. So they use what's called a trimmed mean, and we can use the language to help us here. They literally are going to trim the data, excuse me. And if we laid out the 100,000 changes in prices of goods or services from negative, the biggest negative, to the largest positive, what the RBA does is they just trim out the bottom 15%, delete that, trim out the top 15%, the biggest increases and the biggest decreases, and they just get an average of the remaining data. Mean means average. The last underlying measure is what's called a weighted median. They just pick the middle. The median is just the middle number out of those 100,000 goods and services, or the changes in prices of those 100,000 goods or services. Now, I wouldn't say you need to know all three underlying methods. The exclusion one here that I wrote before, and these two, I think know one and know why it's important. All right, in the next video, we'll actually look at calculating the inflation rate from some CPI data. See you then.